I can't take it any longer. Everything I do here. Sitting at this desk, staring at this screen. Work, school, rest. The lines disappear in this room. There is no more work-life balance. I can't focus on anything for more than a minute. But what is a minute in this room? I've lost all sense of time. I can't remember what day of the week it is, or how many months have passed since I've left this room. And please don't make me think about the year. It's been more than a year, hasn't it? Since I've had a genuine conversation with another human being. Man is a social animal, and I'm not sure how much longer I can keep living this inhuman life. Why is YouTube recommending me this anime dog?
I'm a guy. Thank you, whoever.
What?
Unless you've been living under an extremely well-insulated rock, of which that rock is surrounded by a Faraday cage which itself is situated in a remote hellscape that no one wants to live in, you've probably noticed the sharp rise of the latest escapist medium that is virtual YouTubers, otherwise known as VTubers.
おはようございます。おはようございます。ああいう VTuber?
I'm Scatman.
And whether or not you jumped on the HoloLive hype train, or you prefer the paths less traveled, you can't deny the fact that this social media phenomenon exploded onto the scene more aggressively and arguably more successfully than any of its other contemporaries within the last decade. And given the current circumstances, it's not hard to see why. A fine blend of everyone being stuck inside on their computers all day and corporate structured management made for the perfect cup of monetizable content. Sprinkle in a concerningly proactive fanbase, and you have the recipe for a seemingly endless positive feedback loop of social capital. Now, I could analyze each of these social economic aspects and try to explain their success, but I don't think I could cover anything that hasn't already been blatantly obvious from a surface-level glance at the situation. No, instead, I want to take a more fundamental approach to understand this parasocial dynamic. To truly understand the rise of VTubers, we must indulge ourselves in the realm of philosophy. And our journey begins in the late 17th century, with a man named Georg Wilhelm Friedrich Hegel, which, for the sake of brevity, I will be referring to simply as Hegel, was a German philosopher contributing to the late modern era of Western philosophy. Hegel was highly revered by his intellectual successors, even being referred to as the Protestant Aquinas, which, if you know anything about Catholic theology, you'd know is saying quite a lot. But some of Hegel's most eccentric and notable achievements occurred in the field of metaphysics, epistemology, and political philosophy, all of which are conveniently discussed in his book, The Phenomenology of Spirit. And it's in this book that we find the story that will help us deconstruct the meteoric rise of VTubers, and better yet, predict what will happen next. In his book, he writes a story of sorts, similar to a Socratic dialogue, but in his own we understand them today as the Hegelian dialectic, the most famous of which, and the most useful to us, being the Lordship and Bondage dialectic. It also goes under the name the Master and Slave dialectic, but taken out of context this name can be problematic, so we'll be sticking to that first one for now. The idea of a dialectic is to expose to each other two diametrically opposed forces, and by exploring how they interact, we can come to understand their relationship and predict how the system as a whole functions. The Hegelian dialectic is regularly presented in 3 parts. First, there is the thesis, where the actors are established and the stage is set for the antithesis, the second part. This is where the initial thesis is contradicted. The conflict and resolution that occurs in this stage culminates in the synthesis, the final part of the story. This philosophical model has been used to exemplify everything from communism to theology, but our text pertains specifically to the abstract realization of self-consciousness. So try not to get too stuck up on the details. Remember, we're using this loosely as a metaphor. I promise we'll be getting back to talking about anime girls soon enough. In the thesis, we are introduced to 2 separate entities. Neither one nor the other in isolation are capable of realizing self-consciousness beyond an acknowledgement of their ability to think. But when both entities come into contact, they find a relationship of mutual self-certainty. When one entertains the notion that the other is another entity, they legitimize their consciousness, and likewise have their own consciousness legitimized through the same transaction. A perfect trade deal. If only it lasted. Because in the antithesis, both entities realize that the mechanism that maintains the legitimacy of their self-consciousness lays in the hands of another. In this, they are exposed to the negative function of their mutual relationship. Wanting to get out, they might consider killing the other, but if they did so, there would be no one to recognize them as a legitimate self-consciousness. A complete stalemate. So instead, a struggle for recognition ensues where each tries to overpower the other, and in the end, the victor of the conflict builds their entire identity around the subjugation of the other, and the other lives for the sole purpose of serving the one that subjugates them. At this point, you might already be drawing the parallels, so I'll switch gears and start talking about anime girls. And from this point forward, I will be referring to the Lordship and Bondage dialectic as the more aptly named Streamer and Simp dialectic. In the thesis of the online space, you as a user on the internet have a digital identity, and through your interactions, you legitimize the online presence of others and likewise have your online presence recognized in the same transaction. However, in the antithesis, users realize their digital identity is dictated not by their internal notion of themselves, but instead by the popular conception of the users that view them. In a much less violent manner than its Hegelian counterpart, the struggle for recognition occurs predominantly with the streamer constructing a mechanism by which they can control how others see them. This subjugation of attention leaves us at the same step where we left off in the Hegelian dialectic. Of course, we know there's more to it than that. VTubers aren't exclusively interested in curating their self-image. It is a business after all. VTubers make a conscious and generally tasteful effort to elicit money from their viewers, and simps are usually more than willing to comply. And this is the situation that most people are familiar with. But to understand where this will lead, we have to understand the final step of each dialectic, the synthesis. And to understand the synthesis, we have to re-examine each part of the antithesis in detail. At first glance, the role of the streamer appears quite nice. They are, after all, in the dominant position of the relationship. However, in their effort to subjugate the other, the streamer inadvertently ties up their conception of themselves in the simp. Everything they do is in relation to subjugating the other. Their digital identity has become dependent on the simp. A streamer doesn't stream if no one is watching. The streamer needs the simp, but the simp doesn't necessarily need the streamer. Even worse, from the Hegelian perspective, the recognition the streamer receives from the simp loses its value by the notion that the simp is lesser than themselves. The streamer desires recognition from an other, an equal. But as we've seen, two equal entities will inevitably enter into a struggle for recognition, and the cycle continues. The streamer therefore never receives the type of recognition they desire, and ironically, ends up being the one trapped by their own success. On the other hand, the simp comes to the realization that they're disposable. They are sometimes literally one in a million, and at any moment the support they give and the work they do can easily be replaced. In the Hegelian dialectic, this is when the simp faces death, and in doing so finds a new appreciation for their role in the universe. They discover that the things they do reflect who they are, and in turn defines a new model of self-realization, one that isn't dependent on the recognition of anyone else. In the end, the subjugator becomes the one trapped in their pursuit for recognition, and the simp learns how to break free from their subjugation by recognizing themselves as an independent self-consciousness. But what does this all mean in the end? Where Hegel's dialectic ends, our story only begins. Imagine this. You've just moved to Japan. You're sad, lonely. But then you find this rabbit conducting morally questionable experiments on Minecraft villagers, and suddenly you're entranced. You become a devout viewer like many others. Then a few months later, CoverCorp starts holding auditions, and the viewer realizes that they're more than just a viewer, and that they can bring happiness to others the same way happiness was brought to them. That is the story of Takanashi Kiara. One could put into question the contradiction of someone voluntarily taking a role that supposedly can only lead to an endless pursuit of recognition, but the difference here lies in the understanding that the streamer has been the viewer at one point and accepts that function in the relationship they plan to create. Obviously, this narrative extends far past VTubers and can be applied to really any form of parasocial relationships. So to conclude this video, I myself have decided to harness this magic and follow in the same step that will ultimately synthesize my new online persona. That's right, I'm becoming a VTuber. Actually, I might just be a regular streamer. I can't really afford an expensive 2D avatar, and even if I could, I don't look all that interesting. So, and speaking of which, I don't think I'd be a very good streamer either, because as I said before, I don't look all that interesting. So, I think for the time being, I'll just stick to being a disembodied voice. I hope you learned something useful today, or at the very least found this video interesting. And if you didn't, that's fine. This channel's not called Things That Are Important, it's called Things That Don't Matter. My name is Clarence, and I'll see you in the next video.